Every few years, Gallup or Pew or some other polling organization does a survey on the reasons people choose to be part of a congregation. Mostly, it seems the respondents are Christian and Jewish folks, but others are included too, and the responses are fairly consistent over time. Right up there with receiving spiritual guidance and worshiping God for some is, in just about every survey, community. People are part of congregations for community. And congregations are pretty good at fostering a sense of community for the most part. We celebrate births and marriages together, we grieve deaths together, and in between all that, we talk about important things and play together and take action for social justice. Everything we do plays a part in building strong, connected communities. And it is tempting to be content with all that, because it really is important. Connecting people to one another is not just life-affirming, it is culturally important to have spaces to sit across from one another and work on deep, important things like spirituality and social justice. And we're all on our own hero journey, as Joseph Campbell liked to talk about, these quests to be our authentic selves. When we find our place, when we sense that we've found our people, we want to just sigh and settle into all the love. And there's not a darn thing wrong with any of that. But our calling to build community is about more than just sharing meals and spending time getting to know one another. It's even about more than getting together to focus on our spirituality. Dr. King talked about beloved community, our theme for this month, as being about a whole lot more than fellowship. Here is his definition as sort of translated or written down by someone at the King Center. King's beloved community, they write, is a global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency will not allow it. Racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. In the beloved community, international disputes will be resolved by peaceful conflict resolution and reconciliation of adversaries instead of military power. Love and trust will triumph over fear and hatred. Peace with justice will prevail over war and military conflict. End quote. So, we are fond sometimes of talking about beloved community, but when we speak of beloved community, we're challenging ourselves to never accept the status quo until all are included. We're calling ourselves to a lifetime of work that moves us toward the North Star of beloved community. We get turned around at this point sometimes, I think. We too easily and too often come to believe that our purpose is to make everyone comfortable in our congregations. That this is what community means, that no one is ever offended. And so we avoid talking about important things for fear of offending someone. But our purpose is not to create some bland and impotent spiritual gathering place with no real impact on the world. Rather, our principles call us to side with love, to expand the welcome table that is beloved community. And friends, sometimes that means folks are going to fuss with one another. Someday, if it hasn't already happened, if it hasn't happened today, you may sit there and hear me advocate for something you don't believe in. Whoever just laughed, that must have happened recently. Or you may find yourself in an obvious minority in this very congregation. That's not easy, but it's common. King believed that as we build toward the beloved community, not only do we need not fear conflict, in fact, he believed we should expect a certain degree of conflict and welcome it. He did believe that conflict should end in reconciliation if all parties were committed to nonviolence, but sometimes rifts run deep. I saw that when I was in Selma, Alabama a few years ago for the 50th anniversary of the marches across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. At that time, I was a member of the Unitarian Universalist Association's National Board of Trustees, and we were invited as a group to attend a worship service that turned out to be like no worship service I have ever been a part of. Packed in this Baptist church were hundreds of people from around the country. We sang together this raucous gospel music, something like the music I grew up singing in the Pentecostal church. So, of course, there were just tears for me the whole time. We heard from Jeremiah Wright and King's daughter Yolanda and Reverend Dr. William Barber. I saw Unitarian Universalist leaders, get this, dancing and crying as they sang, "Precious Lord, take my hand." It was amazing. I thought for sure the rapture had happened. At a certain point in the service, those who were part of Dr. King's organizing collective, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, were called forward to be honored for their work in Selma in the 60s. As they made their way to the platform, I was sitting sort of off to the left, and I heard grumbling coming from back here. And eventually someone stood and said, "Hey, SNCC is in the building too." They were talking about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who had been organizing in Selma for years before King and the SCLC came, and as some members of SNCC see it, stole their thunder. A 50-year-old rift, still active, although they did eventually end up being on stage and loving on one another and being recognized together. That sort of thing happens all the time in organizing. Maybe not to that degree. Maybe we solve it before it gets 50 years in, but there was grouchiness, there is grouchiness among organizing groups in Red for Ed. But we keep moving forward together, keep doing good work together, and usually reconciliation happens. Conflict will happen when lots of smart people are working hard on the same issues, and that's okay. But there's another kind of conflict too, and I think that one's even more tricky. If we're serious about building beloved community, and I know we are, we will, not we may, but we will come into conflict with people in power. Legislators, business owners, community leaders of other kinds, we just will. Because when we advocate for adding a chair at the welcome table, someone often has to move over to make room, and people often don't want to move over. The way things are usually benefits people who are doing well and holding power. So if we want more folks included in the prosperity of this very prosperous country, if we want to move toward the beloved community that King talked about, we may sometimes have to elbow in. We are going to cross people in power. Lately, I'm receiving an ongoing education in just what it means to work for beloved community for folks who haven't traditionally been included. My oldest child has come out as being transgender, and we've made that really public. She's decided that she and Dad will talk together about how to advocate publicly. But I am drinking from a fire hose of information. That's sort of the stage I'm in right now. As part of that, I've read Sarah McBride's book, Tomorrow Will Be Different: Love, Loss, and the Fight for Trans Equality. If you don't know Sarah McBride, she's a young trans woman who's just deeply politically oriented. As a young child, she tells stories of at 8 or 9 years old, she would memorize and repeatedly deliver political speeches around her house. She even built a podium out of cardboard so that she could do that. She became the first out transgender person to speak to a National Party's convention when she spoke at the 2016 Democratic National Convention. One story from Sarah's book sticks with me. It speaks to me of the difficulties of moving toward beloved community. She's waiting to advocate for a transgender rights bill in her home state of Delaware. She's in the halls of the legislature somewhere, when someone calls out her name, Sarah. She says, "I turned around to see an angry woman, maybe one of the moms who had showed up to the committee hearing the previous week. I just have one question for you," she said. "Have you had the surgery yet?" I don't think that's any of your business," I replied, stunned. To this day, she said, it always amazes me when people think they're entitled to information about my body. I would never ask a stranger about their genitals. Some lessons shouldn't need to be taught. But she says, I quickly got the sense that this woman didn't care if she was imposing, let alone offending me. Oh, I think it is my business, she insisted, and if I ever see you in the women's bathroom with me. And then this so-called Christian woman made a threat that is not appropriate for the pulpit this morning. And Sarah writes, still processing the initial rudeness, I almost didn't realize what the woman had just said to me, that she would assault me if she saw me in the restroom. A staffer nearby suggested I report the woman to Capitol Police, and she says I reluctantly decided to do so. I wanted a record of this woman's comments and threat of physical violence, but I was embarrassed and worried about the reaction I'd get from the officers. I didn't want to talk to them about my body, even if it was just in reference to the comments the woman had made. I was worried they'd laugh at me. Frankly, in the grand scheme of things, being laughed at by the police would have been a relatively tame encounter for a transgender person interacting with law enforcement. One survey found that among transgender people who had interacted with a police officer who thought or knew that they were transgender, 58% reported mistreatment. For others, it could include violence, and for trans women of color, the risk of this treatment skyrockets. These experiences led more than half of transgender people overall to say they were uncomfortable asking the police for help. But, she says, I stepped into the office of the Capitol Police, right next to the metal detectors and x-ray machine at the entrance of the building. Word for word, I told the officers what had happened. I wasn't laughed at, but I didn't get the impression that the officers cared much for my report. They implied that the woman's threat was par for the course. They suggested that it was what I got for working publicly to pass a controversial bill. But the threat of violence shouldn't be part of and parcel for advocating for your own dignity, she concludes. Was I surprised that someone threatened me? No. But the fact that it wasn't surprising should be an outrage. It further underscored the need for protections from discrimination and harassment. If we think we can remain above the fray, make every conversation nice and end with hugs, and at the same time work for equality, for trans people, for people of color, for women, for Muslim, for immigrants, for the poor, well, maybe we haven't been paying enough attention. Beloved community requires those in power to yield some of that power, and that usually doesn't come easy. All this leads me to think about one of my least favorite questions to receive as a UU minister. People get the mistaken idea that Unitarian Universalism is mainly about tolerance. And a few have actually asked me, what if a Nazi showed up in your congregation? Would you accept them? And I say, sure. But they had better come in a spirit of repentance, ready to turn from their hate and make a difference for love in the world. That's universalism. Otherwise, no, we won't tolerate hate in the sanctuary because we're about more than tepid tolerance. We're about beloved community, love and justice, and human growth toward wholeness and inclusion. Our vision is not of a place where there is no conflict and every harebrained idea is accepted as just as valid as any other. Rather, ours is a strong vision of the true inclusion of every human being in the prosperity of this country. Hatred and discrimination have no place in that vision, and we can say that boldly and not apologize. In 1966, Dr. King gave a lecture to a room full of Unitarian Universalists who were gathered for our General Assembly. In it, he said words that I think apply as if they were written yesterday. He said, it's not enough for the church to work in the ideological realm and to clear up misguided ideas. To remain awake through this social revolution, the church must engage in strong action programs to get rid of the last vestiges of segregation and discrimination. It is necessary to get rid of one or two myths if we're really going to engage in this kind of action program, he said. One is the notion that legislation is not effective in bringing about the changes that we need in human relations. This argument says that you've got to change the heart in order to solve the problem, that you can't change the heart through legislation. They would say that you've got to do that through religion and education. Well, he said there's some truth in this. Before we can solve these problems, men and women must rise to the majestic heights of being obedient to the unenforceable. That's a great line. I would be the first to say this, he said. If we're to truly have an integrated society, white persons and Negro persons and members of all groups must live together, not merely because the law says it, but because it's natural and because it's right. But that doesn't make legislation less important. It may be true that you can't legislate integration, but you can legislate desegregation. It may be true that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. It may be true, and another great line here, that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. The law cannot make a man love me, but it can restrain him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important also. And so while the law may not change the hearts of men, it does change the habits of men. So it is necessary for the church, he said, to support strong, meaningful civil rights legislation, end quote. I, frankly, have had enough of people trying to relegate congregations to the realm of the spiritual, whatever that even means to people in the 21st century. In other words, King challenged us, don't just talk about it, do something. And I see you doing the hard work of inclusion. This Red for Ed movement, as one example, is deeply intersectional. It has to do with gender and what it means that most teachers are women in our society. It has to do with children of color who are more often victimized by the lack of funding than white kids who tend to live in numbers in more prosperous neighborhoods. All the intersections, social class, are there in the Red for Ed movement, and I see you doing work to make sure that teachers and children are included in the prosperity that some are trying to hoard for themselves. These movements are not easy, and they're not for the faint of heart, and this one ain't even close to over. But we're marching together toward beloved community, and my earnest prayer is this: when our work on earth is done, may there be more people at the welcome table then than there were when we began. May it be so. Amen.